Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, President Trump and the Republicans have been in charge of the White House, the House of Representatives, and the United States Senate for nearly a year now. And under their control, these three institutions have formed a Bermuda Triangle, if you will, for any kind of meaningful legislation that will help average Americans. They devoted most of last year to a destructive attempt to eliminate health insurance coverage for 30 million Americans before pivoting to a partisan tax bill that benefits the powerful, costs trillions of dollars that could be spent many ways, including to enhance and improve our military equipment and our military personnel. But that $1.5 trillion was dedicated to tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans, by and large, not to the men and women of the military. And this tax legislation will also leave 13 million Americans without health insurance. So contrary to the president's declarations through the campaign that he's got a great plan that's going to cover all Americans, 13 million Americans have lost their coverage. And now Congress is 2 days away from a government shutdown because, again, the majority and the president appear uninterested in governing, which means compromise. It means working on policy together with both Republicans and Democrats to deal with the real priorities like jobs and education, infrastructure, and national security that are essential to the American people. Now, the press has been focusing on the Trump-caused immigration crisis as the supposed cause for the Republican dilemmas at the moment. And it's true that finding a solution for Dreamers is very important. Indeed, a poll cited by the Washington Post editorial board this morning says 82% of voters, including almost 70% of Republican voters, believe that there should be a path to citizenship for Dreamers. But, Madam President, this immigration crisis is not the only unfinished business before Congress. Republican leaderships failed to make the effort early on to deal with some of the issues that are now facing us directly and affecting millions of Americans. And if you just think about some of the issues, since September, 9 million children who are covered by the CHIP program have essentially been going month to month on their health care coverage because the President and this Congress hasn't passed a 10-year extension that actually saves taxpayers money. And community health care centers are such a vital part of our health care system. More than 25 million Americans use these centers, and once again, their funding is in limbo because the program has not been reauthorized. And then there's the bipartisan Alexander Murray bill to provide greater stability to the private health insurance markets. Again, from a president who claimed that he had a great plan to insure all Americans much better than the Affordable Care Act, there's been no movement on this important aspect of improving private health care insurance for Americans. And what about issues like the flood insurance program? We saw devastating floods hit Florida and Texas. We know they're coming again. In fact, last year was the largest year in terms of government expenditures for storm damage that we've seen, including some of the wildfires that raged in the West. We know the floods will come again, and yet a program we have for flood insurance is woefully underfunded, but that's not being dealt with. And then, of course, at the heart of what so many have talked about are the issue of the lingering sequestration caps that jeopardize defense and non-defense alike. Indeed, the way these caps are structured, our national security is jeopardized if we don't raise both defense and non-defense spending, because under the category of non-defense is the State Department and other critical agencies. And without funding, they won't be able to protect the country, along with our Defense Department personnel. And we have sought, over many, many months, a balanced solution to provide the resources necessary to cover the gamut of government programs for the benefit of all Americans. As I mentioned before, in terms of the flood insurance, we have American citizens in Puerto Rico, they're all American citizens, who along with the people of Texas and Florida and California because of their wildfires and recent floods, they desperately need additional help, and we should respond. And just as an aside, one other proposal the president made at the campaign was for a really big infrastructure program, $1 trillion. He was going to do that in the first 100 days. Well, a year later, we're still waiting. But in that time, we have seen $1.5 trillion being dedicated to tax cuts before anything else. And there's very little room left, given our fiscal situation, for the robust kind of efforts that he promised within his first 100 days. And once again, the issue that has captured the imagination of so many, it's the issue of the Dreamers I mentioned before. The president decided that he would remove protections for these individuals, 800,000 of them, a few months ago, last September, creating a crisis that need not have been created. And we know that the American people want these young people to get a chance to stay here. They are working, they are serving in the military, they are going to school, they are contributing to this community, and the president, of his own volition, decided he was going to create a crisis. And that crisis is now weighing heavily on us, because if we can't resolve this issue, there's a danger that these young men and women could be immediately or very promptly removed from the country. And we've been talking about this for months, but that's no progress. We thought, and again, I was very impressed with Senator Graham's testimony before the Judiciary Committee, we thought on Tuesday we had a solution, because on Tuesday the president was talking about love and comprehensive reform of our immigration laws and working together. In fact, he was flanked on both sides by Senator Durbin on one side, Representative Hoyer on the other side. Well, that was Tuesday. Come Thursday, it seemed to be a different president in tone, a different president in terms of willingness to cooperate, a different president in terms of bipartisanship. And we just hope that before too long, President Tuesday returns, because we don't want to shut down. We want, in fact, a comprehensive solution to our problems. Now, when it comes to this particular issue of the Dreamers, as I've suggested, both Senator Graham and Senator Durbin have done a remarkable job working together in that good old-fashioned bipartisan way of finding a good middle ground in which we can provide some sense of security for the Dreamers. We can provide what the president wants, border security. We can think about a first step towards comprehensive immigration reform. That's the way we like to think this Senate, this House, and this government would operate. They've done their part, but they were met, as I said Thursday, with just unpredictable rejection and a tone that is not presidential, but far from that. Now, we've got to get that job done, and I hope we can do that. And we have all heard the compelling stories of these Dreamers. They've come in, they've visited us, they've talked about what they're doing, they've talked about how they want to continue to contribute to the country. And again, I think we have to do that for them, but also because they provide a significant economic contribution to this country. The Center for American Progress has indicated if they lose their right to work lawfully, it could reduce our GDP by over $433 billion over the next decade. And that's going to be a blow. It'd be $60 million over this decade to my home state of Rhode Island. So not only is it the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do in terms of our economic well-being as a nation. Now, it's still possible to break through this deadlock. It's not over till it's over. It's the famous quote. We still have time, but not much time, to provide for appropriate relief for the Dreamers, to provide a funding for our national security, that's defense and non-defense functions, to raise the caps so that we can deal with this, to do it hopefully not just for a short period of time, but for at least 2 years. But another sort of kick the can down the road is, I think, going to be unacceptable. Another couple of more days, even with an inducement here and there to a nod at some of these policies that have not been actuated yet. But I think that would be the wrong approach. I think we have to sit down and get it done. This agenda has been the president's agenda, not the Democratic minority's agenda. That's what happens when you control both the presidency, the House, and the Senate. You set the agenda. Some should have argued that we should have been talking about infrastructure in January, last January. Some should have argued that we should have been talking about budget caps last January and have a situation where we would be passing budgets on time. Some of the complaints of my colleagues, and I hear them, is it's not just the fact that the funding isn't sufficient, it's the uncertainty of funding that affects our readiness in the military, that affects our ability in non-DOD functions to deal effectively and efficiently with problems that face Americans. So this agenda has been an agenda that, as I mentioned, was preoccupied, just fixated on taking apart Obamacare, and that failed. And then it shifted not to infrastructure, not to our budget problems, not to other factors, but to tax cuts. And $1.5 trillion of deficit was incurred. Again, if you look at some of these military programs, for example, the whole reinvigoration of our nuclear posture, which is be the subject of the nuclear posture review, it's been estimated over a decade or more to cost in the vicinity of $1 trillion. I think some people can ask very sincerely, strong defense advocates, well, if we're going to borrow $1.5 trillion, why don't we use it on military equipment that we know we have to improve? Why are we giving it, and proportionally to the richest Americans? That, I think, are questions that have been resolved and were resolved by the President and the leadership here in the Senate and the House. We're here because I think most Americans want to get things done. They do, as I suggested by my polling numbers from the Washington Post, they want overwhelmingly to see the Dreamers have a path to freedom. They want to see people in Texas and Florida and Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands get the help they need because of a natural disaster. They want health care for children, the CHIP program. They want these children to be able to go to community health centers because that's where a vast majority of them go. They want to go ahead and ensure that these things are accomplished. So now's the chance to govern. And the levers of government are clearly in the hands of a Republican president, a Republican Senate, and a Republican House. And those levers should be moving for the American people. With that, Madam President, I would thank you for the absence of quorum.